skies had given her decision. The thrill ran through us. I felt the queen draw herself together at my side. I felt the muscles of Rischenheim's arm, which rested against my shoulder, grow rigid and taut. Sapt's face was full of eagerness, and he gnawed his moustache silently. We gathered closer to one another. At last we could bear the suspense no longer. With one look at the queen and another at me, Sapt stepped on to the gravel. He would go and learn the answer. Thus the unendurable strain that had stretched us like tortured men on a rack would be relieved. The queen did not answer his glance, nor even seem to see that he had moved. Her eyes were still all for Mr. Rassendyll, her thoughts buried in his, for her happiness was in his hands, and lay poised on the issue of that decision whose momentousness held him for a moment motionless on the path. Often I seemed to see him as he stood there, tall, straight, and stately, the king a man's fancy paints when he reads of great monarchs who flourished long ago in the springtime of the world. Sapt's step crunched on the gravel. Rudolf heard it and turned his head. He saw Sapt, and he saw me also behind Sapt. He smiled composedly and brightly, but he did not move from where he was. He held out both hands towards the constable, and caught him in their double grasp, still smiling down in his face. I was no nearer to reading his decision, though I saw that he had reached a resolution that was immovable, and gave peace to his soul. If he meant to go on, he would go on now, on to the end, without a backward look or a falter of his foot. If he had chosen the other way, he would depart without a murmur or a hesitation. The queen's quick breathing had ceased. She seemed like a statue, but Rischenheim moved impatiently, as though he could no longer endure the waiting. Sapt's voice came harsh and grating. "Well?" he cried. "Which is it to be? Backward or forward?" Rudolf pressed his hands and looked into his eyes. The answer asked but a word from him. The queen caught my arm. Her rigid limbs seemed to give way, and she would have fallen if I had not supported her. At the same instant a man sprang out of the dark line of tall trees directly behind Mr. Rassendyll. Bernenstein uttered a loud startled cry and rushed forward, pushing the queen herself violently out of his path. His hand flew to his side, and he ripped the heavy cavalry sword that belonged to his uniform of the cuirassiers of the guard from its sheath. I saw it flash in the moonlight, but its flash was quenched in a brighter, short blaze. A shot rang out through the quiet gardens. Mr. Rassendyll did not loose his hold of Sapt's hands, but he sank slowly on to his knees. Sapt seemed paralyzed. Again Bernenstein cried out. It was a name this time. "Bauer! By God, Bauer!" he cried. In an instant he was across the path and by the trees. The assassin fired again, but now he missed. We saw the great sword flash high above Bernenstein's head and heard it whistle through the air. It crashed on the crown of Bauer's head, and he fell like a log to the ground with his skull split. The queen's hold on me relaxed. She sank into Rischenheim's arms. I ran forward and knelt by Mr. Rassendyll. He still held Sapt's hands, and by their help buoyed himself up. But when he saw me, he let go of them and sank back against me, his head resting on my chest. He moved his lips, but seemed unable to speak. He was shot through the back. Bauer had avenged the master whom he loved, and was gone to meet him. There was a sudden stir from inside the palace. Shutters were flung back and windows thrown open. The group we made stood clean cut, plainly visible in the moonlight. A moment later there was a rush of eager feet, and we were surrounded by officers and servants. Bernenstein stood by me now, leaning on his sword. Sapt had not uttered a word. His face was distorted with horror and bitterness. Rudolf's eyes were closed, and his head lay back against me. "A man has shot the king," said I, in bald, stupid explanation. All at once I found James, Mr. Rassendyll's servant, by me. "I have sent for doctors, my lord," he said. "Come, let us carry him in." He, Sapt, and I lifted Rudolf and bore him across the gravel terrace and into the little saloon. We passed the queen. She was leaning on Rischenheim's arm and held my wife's hand. We laid Rudolf down on a couch. Outside I heard Bernenstein say, "Pick up that fellow and carry him somewhere out of sight." Then he also came in, followed by a crowd. He sent them all to the door. and we were left alone waiting for the surgeon. The Queen came up, Rischenheim still supporting her. "Rudolf, Rudolf," she whispered very softly. He opened his eyes, and his lips bent in a smile. She flung herself on her knees and kissed his hand passionately. "The surgeon will be here directly," said I. Rudolf's eyes had been on the Queen. As I spoke he looked up at me, smiled again, and shook his head. I turned away. When the surgeon came, Sapt and I assisted him in his examination. The Queen had been led away, and we were alone. The examination was very short. Then we carried Rudolf to a bed. The nearest chanced to be in Bernenstein's room. There we laid him, and there all that could be done for him was done. All this time we had asked no questions of the surgeon, and he had given no information. We knew too well to ask. We had all seen men die before now, and the look on the face was familiar to us. 2 or 3 more doctors, the most eminent in Strelsau, came now, having been hastily summoned. It was their right to be called, but for all the good they were, they might have been left to sleep the night out in their beds. They drew together in a little group at the end of the room and talked for a few minutes in low tones. James lifted his master's head and gave him a drink of water. Rudolf swallowed it with difficulty. Then I saw him feebly press James's hand, for the little man's face was full of sorrow. As his master smiled, the servant mustered a smile in answer. I crossed over to the doctors. "Well, gentlemen?" I asked. They looked at one another. Then the greatest of them said gravely, "The king may live an hour. Count Fritz, should you not send for a priest?" I went straight back to Rudolf Rassendyll. His eyes greeted me and questioned me. He was a man, and I played no silly tricks with him. I bent down and said, "An hour, they think, Rudolf." He made one restless movement, whether of pain or protest I do not know. Then he spoke, very low, slowly, and with difficulty. "Then they can go," he said, and when I spoke of a priest he shook his head. I went back to them and asked if anything more could be done. The answer was nothing, but I could not prevail further than to get all save one sent into an adjoining room. He who remained seated himself at a table some way off. Rudolf's eyes had closed again. Old Sapt, who had not once spoken since the shot was fired, raised a haggard face to mine. "We'd better fetch her to him," he said hoarsely. I nodded my head. Sapt went while I stayed by him. Bernenstein came to him, bent down and kissed his hand. The young fellow who had borne himself with such reckless courage and dash throughout the affair was quite unmanned now, and the tears were rolling down his face. I could have been in much the same plight, but I would not before Mr. Rassendyll. He smiled at Bernenstein. Then he said to me, "Is she coming, Fritz?" "Yes, she's coming, sire," I answered. He noticed the style of my address. A faint, amused gleam shot into his languid eyes. "Well, for an hour, then," he murmured, and lay back on his pillows. She came, dry-eyed, calm, and queenly. We all drew back, and she knelt down by his bed, holding his hand in her 2 hands. Presently the hand stirred. She let it go. Then, knowing well what he wanted, she raised it herself and placed it on her head, while she bowed her face to the bed. His hand wandered for the last time over the gleaming hair that he had loved so well. She rose, passed her arm about his shoulders, and kissed his lips. Her face rested close to his, and he seemed to speak to her, but we could not have heard the words, even if we would. So they remained for a long while. The doctor came and felt his pulse, retreating afterwards with close shut lips. We drew a little nearer, for we knew that he would not be long with us now. Suddenly strength seemed to come upon him. He raised himself in his bed and spoke in distinct tones. "God has decided," he said. "I've tried to do the right thing through it all. Sapt and Bernenstein.